Good morning. Welcome to this seminar with John Sabelhaus on behalf of the AARP Public Policy Institute, our internal think tank, and we're delighted to be co-hosting this with the Wharton Pension Research Council. A quick moment before I turn this over to Olivia for her welcome. Why is this important? Why is this topic important? We know that the U.S. Retirement savings system works for many people, but it doesn't work for everyone. And one of the important things is to discover who is left out. Now, we have some data sources that allow us to give some approximations on a national level, but that really, we know that national statistics can hide certain populations and where they're located, et cetera. So instead, what we've been seeking to do and what John is going to be discussing here is to find a methodology where we can also look at the people who are left out who have no workplace retirement savings plan or pension on the state level. And we're looking at a variety of demographic sources. It's not just racial and ethnic or the size of firms, but also what is the education level? What is the income level? What are a variety of other topics or other characteristics that we can look at. And this will help us to develop better methods to fill this population gap and make the U.S. Financial system much more inclusive and much more satisfactory as far as outcomes go. This data will be available hopefully within the next month, but maybe a little longer in a national fact sheet and 50 state fact sheets where you can actually look and see. This is especially important, of course, as the states are stepping up to come up with their own solutions through whether it's state auto IRAs or MEPs or a variety of other methods here. And with that, over to Olivia.
Thanks so very much, David, and thanks to especially John for participating in this event and speaking out. On behalf of the Pension Research Council at the Wharton School, a very warm welcome to everybody. This week, as you may know, to set the context, the Social Security trustees have issued their annual report, and the news is unfortunately still bad. Insolvency still looms, not that far off in the future. Story is worse for Medicare. And I think this is one reason it's so important to focus our attention on employer-provided retirement plans. The work in this paper with John and his co-author sheds light on a very broad debate, not only the new data and the new evidence, but also the issue of intergenerational fairness and the issue of economic progress across generations. And so the pace of wealth accumulation is a very important part of that discussion. So this is a critical paper, a key contribution. And with that, let me turn it over to John. Over to you.
Thank you, Olivia. I am really excited to be here. And hopefully everybody is seeing my screens now. Give me a nod, Olivia. Great. Thank you very much. So the front page, current state of U.S. workplace retirement plan coverage. This is work that was sponsored by AARP Public Policy Institute. And I want to give my thanks to David, Gary Koenig, and Joel Eskovitz, as well as Olivia, for some valuable insights and comments while the work was ongoing. My current affiliations are Brookings and Michigan, and please don't take anything I say as indicative of their views on these topics. So the first slide, I think usually I try and get through the first slide pretty quick. This one is going to be a little bit longer because this project, like a lot of my more interesting projects in my new life, started with a great question from an old friend. David John called and said, what do we know about what's happening with employer-sponsored retirement coverage? And that should have been a quick question, but we ended up talking for quite a long time. And basically, we worked through the points that are on this first slide. There are no comprehensive, detailed time series data on U.S. employer-sponsored retirement coverage. They simply don't exist. The CPS ASAC at one time was thought to be a good measure. David and his colleagues at AARP used it to generate the state fact sheets that we're going to be talking about by the end of this presentation. But the coverage measures were suspiciously low relative to what I was seeing in the SCF and work I was doing with Vicki Bryant. And more importantly, relative to some work that my former colleagues at ICI, Peter Brady and Stephen Bass, were doing looking at tax data. Using industry sources and tax data. And this gap between what we were seeing in the CPS ASAC and the other data sets exploded after the CPS was redesigned in 2013. So these gaps were sort of confirmed by the fact that around that time, the Statistics of Income Division at IRS, so this is Victoria Bryan as well as Kevin Pierce and others, started producing coverage statistics based on W-2 filing. So on W-2, we know, for example, whether somebody has the box check saying you had employer-sponsored coverage. That's really important for your ability to claim an IRA deduction, for example. But they also know, based on amounts filled in under certain codes, how much was contributed to a retirement plan. So this is a fabulous source. We'll be talking more about this as we go, but in effect became sort of a new national benchmark that we should think about. This is the total amount of coverage for a given population. But as David and I continue talking, this last bullet really comes into focus, which is I wrote here CPS versus the SCF versus the Statistics of Income is still apples to oranges. It's really apples to oranges to pears. And none of the three data sets are internally consistent with each other across a lot of different dimensions. For example, really important questions like what is the population that we're studying? Is it just workers, just private sector workers, all workers? What is coverage? Is it coverage or is it participation? When we think about what's on a W-2 form, certain types of participation are clearly included. If the employer has you in a DB plan, the box is checked. But what if you're in a DC plan and you're not contributing? What is being captured on the W-2? And these are things we need to think about. Other things like what is the unit of time? Are we measuring coverage the day that the survey is conducted? In the SCF, for example, we saw a lot of people saying, I'm not covered by my employer plan, but I will be within a couple of months, right? They've just been hired at the job and things like that. Finally, we think about, are we talking about the person or the couple, right? So we think about families having joint assets and liabilities all the time, their pension benefits to some extent, in some ways meet the same legal thresholds of being a joint asset. So all of these questions are going to confound the things throughout the presentation, and they're important to keep in mind. Those were my initial answers to David when he called me about this question, and he said, "Well, jump in, see what you can find out." And when I move to the next slide, I would be remiss if I didn't point out that I would have given up pretty quickly in terms of being able to say, this is what I can do with publicly available data. But right about the same time, Craig Copeland at EBRI released a paper talking about the CPS redesign. And he was focused on exactly that issue of the increasing gap between what the CPS was showing and what the SOI tax data was showing. And what he did was he looked at this variable, a new variable on the redesigned CPS that measures the ownership of retirement accounts. The BEA had added this variable. Census had added this variable in order to better distribute that form of income. If we know how retirement accounts are distributed, we can distribute the income, the dividends and interest being earned on those retirement accounts. That was their main reason for adding that variable. But what Craig's initial foray into the data showed is that if we think of coverage as being captured by either the original CPS questions, do you have pension coverage? We'll talk more about those in a minute, or the existence of the retirement account, then all of a sudden we're getting numbers that are in the ballpark of the SOI. And that was what really led this project. That was the kick that got this project moving. And we decided to take it seriously and try and come up with an answer using publicly available data to the question, what's happening to employer-sponsored workplace retirement coverage. The one problem with doing that, and why it's not just a question of two data sets or even just one, the CPS, is the fact that if we just use the observation of retirement accounts, it actually biases up the CPS. It makes it too high, the workplace retirement coverage. And the reason is there may be some people in the CPS who are currently working, who currently lack employer-sponsored coverage, but they have a retirement account for some other reason. Either it came from a past job, or they might have even inherited it. If we're measuring things like IRAs, they might have inherited that account. So if we just use the ownership of retirement account and the answers to the original questions to measure coverage, we're going to have some upward bias. And this is where the SCF comes in, because the SCF does a really good job of capturing both retirement accounts and retirement plan coverage versus participation. There's a very detailed module in the SCF that's a huge focus of the SCF. It's anybody who's ever gone through the SCF questionnaire knows how much time that and the business module are two of the longest in the survey in terms of capturing assets. So it's very useful for this purpose. And in some ways, if the CPS could do the SCF module, which it never could, it's just much too long and cumbersome, that would be one answer to this question. And then the final bullet, and what actually led us to today, is that after we make this bias correction using the SCF, the CPS tracks the statistics of income by age and earnings, and we have the desired detail. The CPS is the only of these data sets that currently has the desired detail in terms of both geography, but also demographic characteristics that we want in order to be able to answer the questions that David posed, right? Why do we care about this? And the answer is we want to know about differences across states and across groups within states in terms of coverage in order to think about better policy. So that's the background and the framing for this project and how we got to where we are. Huge cast of characters, and I noticed that many of you are signed in. I really look forward to hearing your thoughts about this as we try and take a step forward with this measurement question. And with that, I'm going to jump right in. So the first set of questions is about whether the CPS and the statistics of income are the same population. Is it the same group of people? So there's three lines on this first chart. The black line is BLS employed persons at any time during the year. And this number is always a little bit higher, but within less than 1% of the CPS measure of wage and salary workers. But it's tracking over time. It's sort of a good benchmark. This is how many people BLS. This is the average monthly employment for the as reported by the BLS. The CPS and the SOI very close to each other, but the gap has been widening in recent years. And this is something where the SOI sampling strategy may come into play in the sense that if we're focused on Form 1040 filing in order to create a sample the way the SOI does, that's actually because fewer people are having to file 1040. That may actually be leading to a deterioration in this SOI sample. And this is something we might want to be talking about towards the end of the presentation. But in general, the trends and the size of the populations are roughly consistent and, more importantly, stable over time. The age distributions are almost identical. And so you're looking at 6 bars. It's in 3 groups. So the first year of the sample that I have to work with, 2008. Then the middle 2 bars are 2013, and the last 2 are 2018. We can focus on any of the pairs of bars. We're going to get the same story. There's very little difference in the age composition of the worker populations. So if we focus on 2018, for those less than 26 years old, 16.1% in the CPS, 16.9% in the SOI. Then we go to 21.2 versus 20.8% for those 26 to 34, all the way up to 6% versus 6.5% for those who are 65 and older. So the population is very much the same as gauged by age. So that's really good news. We are comparing apples to apples in that sense. if we look at the earnings distribution, the other key dimension that we're going to be using to sort of pull these data sets together and reconcile the discrepancies is a little bit more of a difference, but I think still the same general pattern, that within a few percentage points in each earnings group. And the reasons for these gaps seem consistent with what we know about the different data sets. So in 2018, for example, in the CPS, there are 10.8% of the observations between $1 and $10,000 of earnings, annual earnings. So very, very low earnings. In the SOI, the tax data, that's 15.5%. Why do we have such a difference? Well, the SOI and all administrative earnings data are very good at capturing events that are either very short-lived, work spells that are very short-lived, might have happened almost a year ago, and for very low amounts, whereas in the CPS, people tend not to answer those things. So in my work on earnings volatility, on earnings distribution generally, this is always the case that you're going to find in the administrative data sort of a fatter tail at the bottom of the earnings distribution. And then that works its way up through the rest of the distribution to where we have slight differences across the other subsets of the population as well. So even though the CPS has more workers, no W-2 is required to be a CPS worker, which sort of changes the overall size of the population. Conditional on being a worker, more of them are going to be at the lower incomes. But these differences in the earnings amounts are not huge, right? The fractions are about the same. And even though coverage varies substantially with earnings, we're able to sort of adjust for that and think about how that impacts the overall coverage estimates. So this just takes those two dimensions, turns it into a joint distribution table. And if you look at this, the CPS and SOI column totals are going to be very similar. So the 16.9%, this is again for the year 2018. 16.1% are reproduced from the previous chart. And then the earnings differences, say $1 to $10,000, 15.5% in the statistics of income. That's that top row in the right column versus 10.8% for the CPS. So we're just reproducing. So there's really not a lot of new information, but let's just jump to the next slide because this takes the gap in each of those cells. So is there anything really happening within the joint distribution? And what we see, for example, is that the SOI has a lot more young, low-income people. So the gap in that cell is 1.2 percentage points. So there's a fairly good sized gap there. Elsewhere, it's really pretty consistent. So there's a lot of low earners at every age, $1,000 to $10,000. But there's always a gap. The SOI is always greater than the CPS, but those gaps are within a percentage point or so. So this is the very good news that the bottom line on the worker populations, the SOI has a slightly larger share of workers in the bottom earnings group. And given the coverage increases sharply with earnings, we're going to see this in a minute, especially above the bottom two earnings groups, in these published SOI tables, we're going to expect and find that the overall CPS coverage rate solved for here is a few percentage points above the published SOI coverage rate. Let me say that again, make sure that really gets driven home. We have more low income, very low attachment workers in the SOI. Given that very low income, very low attachment workers are much less likely to have employer-sponsored coverage, that's going to pull down the overall average. The amount by which it pulls down the overall average, think of what's in the table you're looking at is the weights on that bias, right? How much it's going to pull it down. And the answer is it's not going to be a whole lot. So we move on then, given this reconciled populations to measuring coverage. So the CPS ASEC questions, they've been around forever, and it's based on a two-part question. First, does your employer offer a plan? And if yes, do you participate in that plan? So the SOI coverage is based on Form W-2, both the check coverage box and evidence of contributions, as I mentioned above. You can get, obviously, the CPS data straight from census, the SOI coverage. If you go to the paper, there's a link there. It's very well documented. It's a beautiful, as most of the SOI data products are, a beautifully organized data product that's easy to use and read into the software or to work with directly in Excel. So this is the starting point. This is where David was when he called me. And this is it captures the fundamental difference between the different coverage measures. So this just uses the CPS pension coverage question. So the way that everybody used to use the CPS prior to this work, prior to Craig Copeland's insight. Each line, you have a solid color for the line, and then you have a dotted, dashed line. And each color represents an income group. And then on the x-axis, we're moving across age groups. So this is our two dimensions, age and earnings. The solid line is always the statistics of income coverage rate. The dotted line, the dashed line, is the CPS coverage rate. So if you want the most glaring examples, the blue and the yellow lines for people between over $100,000 of earnings or between $50,000 and $100,000 of earnings, the SOI coverage rates are 80%, roughly, at most ages. And then they drop a little bit at age 65. The equivalent CPS lines based on just the coverage questions are almost 40 percentage points lower, 20 to 30 percentage point lower at least relative to these benchmarks from the tax data. So immediately we know we've got a pretty serious problem with the CPS. The gray line says that we're about 15 to 20 percentage points low for those earning between 25 and 50,000. The other two lines sort of capture these differences in the populations that I talked about at the beginning. The fact that the people who are less than $10,000 in the CPS are really a different group of people than those who are less than $10,000 in the SOI tax data. And therefore the CPS is actually a little bit higher in the CPS, at that earnings level. And in some ways, this doesn't affect the aggregates too much because there's just not many people below. You know, we're talking about 10% of the population who has those very low earnings. So it's not going to change things too much, but it is worth seeing how the CPS is sort of a compressed version. You don't see the differences by earnings across the age distribution that you see in the tax data. So as I mentioned, the CPS redesigned asked about the existence of retirement accounts in order to measure dividend and interest income from such accounts. And so some people have accounts, but no current coverage. So using this combined indicator is biased up. So we're going to go to the exact same type of picture, but now we're going to use Craig Copeland's insight. We're going to say, if we count somebody as having current coverage, they have to obviously be currently working. If they answered the CPS questions that they're covered, then they're going to be covered here. Or if they have a retirement account, they're going to be covered here. And you can see that it brings the lines very much into alignment with actually two sort of key sorts of bias that would come about and make a lot of sense when you step back and think about it. Using the existence of a retirement account for a current worker as indicator of current coverage is biased at older ages especially. Therefore, the dashed lines, you can see them sort of kicking up above the solid lines at ages 65 plus. But also across the earnings distribution. At very high earnings, for example, it's going to be very low earnings, rather. It's going to be that's a typo there. It's going to be biased. So it's going to push those green and red dashed lines up. And because if you are a low earner and you have a retirement account, that probably came from somewhere else, or it's more likely to have come from somewhere else. So the final step in sort of refining Craig's insight and building that into this data set is to use the SCF to do a bias correction. So the expanded coverage of the CPS that I just showed you uses the answers to the pension questions or retirement accounts. How can we identify workers who own retirement accounts but lack current coverage? That is, they are working, they have a retirement account, but they don't have current coverage. And the solution is the SCF. So basically what I'm going to do is take the SCF and compute the probability of not having current coverage, given that you're working and you have a retirement account. And the CPS SOI data suggests, and the SCF confirms, that older and lower earners are more likely not to have coverage, conditional on having a retirement account. So there's a lot of numbers in these next few tables. I apologize for that. We're going to look by age, and then we're going to look by earnings. And so across these age groups, I'm going to compare the CPS and the SCF And so the first thing you'll note is that the SCF does have more retirement account owners generally than the CPS. And that also makes sense. In part because of the SCF sample. It's just the respondents and their spouses. It's not everyone. So especially in age groups less than 26, 26 to 34, and even 65 plus, you're much more likely to have what we would call non-primary economic unit members of the SCF household. So that's going to change the denominator and change the ownership rate. I think also the SCF, again, is just much more focused on collecting the different types of retirement accounts. But what's key, if you look at the bottom line here, the SCF coverage, given that you have a retirement account, it shows the pattern by age that we would expect. For most age groups, 90% of those who have a retirement account and currently have a job also have current coverage. That makes sense. That's most of us, right? When we get to 65 and older, then all of a sudden it drops quite substantially down to 60%, 62.3% to be precise. And that's because many of those folks, they're in their second job, a post-career job. They don't have coverage. They don't need coverage necessarily on that second job, on that post-career job. And therefore, but they do have retirement accounts from some earlier jobs. So this is exactly the group that's going to bias the answer. So this just, the second bullet just states what I just said. So when we look by earnings, we get the same thing, except it's moving in the other direction. So amongst low earners, say between $1,000 and $10,000, only 21.6% of those who have a retirement account and are working and earning less than $10,000 have current coverage. So it's this low earner, older worker that for whom these statistics are going to be most biased. And so the idea is I'm going to take the SCF. I'm not going to walk through the methodology here. It's written up in the paper and it's available for anybody else to use. And take the SCF and apply this conditional adjustment that basically says conditioned on having a retirement account and being a current worker, what's the probability that you don't have current coverage? Apply that to the CPS, that imputation adjustment to the CPS, and then we get these lines which are much more closely aligned than we had if we just took any evidence of retirement coverage as an indicator. So the residual gaps have been closed basically among the older workers. That's the main thing, and the higher earning workers. Again, the coverage rates are very low at the bottom of the earnings distribution anyway. We still have some residual gaps, and this is because of differences in population we're never going to be able to resolve. But in general, these lines are brought very much, the gap between the CPS and the SOI is closed to a large extent. The residual differences that exist tend to be for smaller populations. The meat of the distribution, of the joint distribution, where most people live, the lines are actually very, very close. So what is this bias? Why did we go to all this trouble? We'll go back to why David, reached out to me a while back. AARP likes to produce these tables of workers lacking coverage as a way. These are inputs into policy deliberations, and this reproduces tables. I'm going to show you this one for the entire U.S. and I'm going to show you for 2 separate states. These are what David indicated will be forthcoming for all 50 states on the website pretty soon. So these are pooled over the years 2018 to 2021 that use this adjusted CPS measure, and the overall fraction of the population lacking coverage is 47.7%. And this is very similar at the top level to what we see in the SOI, which is, I mentioned down there at the bottom, if you take their population of all workers, it's 47.2%. But there are still differences in these populations, and so there's some offsetting biases that are bringing those two numbers into alignment. But basically, what it says is that about 53% of workers have some form of retirement plan coverage. I will also point out, I didn't put it here; it's in the paper, that both the adjusted CPS and the SOI show some not great news, but at least it's in the right direction news, that since over this period, 2008 to 2018, coverage rates have gone up. What's more important, and this gets to the broad questions that David laid out, how does coverage differ across age groups, right? Across race and ethnicity, education, gender, employer size, and earnings. And none of these patterns are going to be a surprise to people who think about retirement coverage and retirement saving, right? Younger workers much more likely to be uncovered than older workers. White population much less likely to be uncovered. Coverage rises with education. Not a lot of difference between male and female. Overall, females have slightly higher coverage. Employer size is a big factor, and earnings is a really big factor. 80% of those earning over $78,000 a year, which puts them in the top quintile, have coverage overall. But what, as David laid out, what we're really trying to do, we're getting a broad sense. And again, everything we've done here with the data set, there's a certain amount of precision I wouldn't want to try and quantify. But what I will say is that there's enough precision here to really draw out key differences across states, and that meets their policy objectives of being able to talk about differences. So for the entire US, 47.7% of the population lacks coverage. In Florida, 58.7%, 10 percentage points higher, lack coverage. And in Pennsylvania, a comparably sized state, only 41.3% lack coverage. So there's a range of 20 percentage points across these two states, and that's really phenomenal. And one of the things that you see that comes out of this analysis is that the differences there are some within groups, but they're mostly they're consistent, right, across the demographic characteristics I talked about. They're just shifted down for Florida relative to Pennsylvania. And what that says is that there's a very different institutional structure or policies at the state level. And this is exactly the sort of question that AARP wants to get at, and why they wanted to have these type of data to be able to talk about differences across these populations. So with that, I'll wrap up. So, I guess one quick takeaway, the redesigned CPS has a silver lining. We didn't know why the CPS was so low relative to the other data sets. Having been around surveys for too long, I certain types of questions, there's going to be biases in the way people think about it. The CPS question has the word pension in it, which for many people, I don't have a pension, I have a 401k, might be their reaction. Much of what was happening, I think, in some census working papers I found, part of the redesign involved changing the imputation strategy for non-response and don't knows. And that could be, that could have been what was why the CPS coverage rate fell even further after the redesign. Anyway, the silver lining is that the existence of the retirement account seems to be a pretty good indicator of workplace coverage. The statistical precision, it seems sufficient to capture the policy questions of interest in terms of coverage by worker type and across states. But I'll close with what I hope becomes a topic of conversation in the next half hour, which is that, this is something that those of us on the outside can do with publicly available data. But there is an amazing amount of work being done right now. I know Andy Whitney at Treasury and Motor Yogo, I think at Penn, just wrote a paper looking at SCF coverage and benchmarking it to coverage estimates that they get that they're building up for a very narrow slice of the population that is most comparable to the SCF population, those in their 50s, and basically finds a little difference between what the SCF has and what they get from their W-2s. And that's kind of consistent with what Vicki and I found, 10 years ago, that the data sets, if you look at them on a comparable basis, they line up pretty well. But basically, the tax data is in terms of being able to talk about differences across states in particular is very useful. And if we start imagining linking in other demographics, we could think about how to populate the rest of the AARP table as well. So linking IRS to W-2s to census records is something I think we should all aspire to and think about generating this. And so hopefully the work that I've done here is enough to keep us growing and keep policymakers focused on what needs to be done. But we as researchers also start spending our time thinking about how we can better inform these sorts of decisions.